Few stories in rock history carry as much emotional weight and quiet heartbreak as the friendship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. On the surface, it was a tale of two boys from Liverpool who dreamed of music together and went on to conquer the world. But beneath the gleaming surface of Beatlemania lay a relationship of astonishing complexity, a bond forged in adolescent enthusiasm, tested by ambition and ego, fractured by years of creative conflict, and ultimately redeemed in the most tender of circumstances during George's final days on Earth. Paul McCartney, naturally confident and possessed of an almost magnetic charisma, grew into the driving force behind the Beatles' music and decisions. George Harrison, talented beyond measure yet perpetually overshadowed by the Lennon-McCartney partnership, spent years struggling to carve out space for his own voice within a group that had essentially been built around someone else's creative alliance. Despite their genuine early affection, cracks began to appear as their personalities pulled them in different directions. Paul's perfectionism and leadership style clashed with George's growing desire for artistic independence and spiritual exploration. These were not merely professional disagreements. They cut deeply into personal territory, evolving over time into years of silence and unresolved grievances that neither man seemed entirely capable of addressing directly. The world only ever saw the finished product, the polished songs, the seamless performances, the carefully curated image of four friends making music together. What lay beneath was far more turbulent, a complicated bond tangled in loyalty, quiet resentment, and a great deal of unspoken pain. Boys from Liverpool. Long before the Beatles became a global phenomenon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison's friendship took root in the streets and schools of Liverpool. Their connection began in 1954 when both attended the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. Paul was older by a year, already known for his quick wit and musical curiosity, while George was quieter, often uncomfortable in the rigid academic environment he disliked. The two rarely bonded over schoolwork. That was never where the real connection would form. Their friendship grew during extended bus rides into the city, where Paul carried his guitar, and George noticed it immediately. A music conversation began that reportedly stretched for hours, both boys discovering they shared an intense passion for rock and roll, skiffle, and the electrifying sounds coming out of America. They bonded over Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard, musicians who seemed to represent a kind of freedom their school lives entirely lacked. For George, hearing Heartbreak Hotel felt like a revelation. He practiced guitar with obsessive dedication, filling school notebooks with instrument drawings and pressing his fingertips raw against the strings. Music was not a hobby for George. From very early on, it was a calling. Paul, shaped musically by his father Jim McCartney, who led a jazz band, recognized something serious in the younger boy's commitment and encouraged it. By 1957, Paul had joined John Lennon's band The Quarrymen and advocated strongly for bringing George into the group. Lennon was initially resistant. George seemed too young, too baby-faced. But when George played a note-perfect version of the rockabilly instrumental Raunchy on a Liverpool bus, the doubts evaporated. He was in. The three of them, Paul, George, and John, became extraordinarily close in those early years, spending hours playing music and talking about their futures with the unguarded intimacy that only very young people can truly achieve before ambition begins to complicate everything. Fame and the growing divide. The Beatles' ascent from Liverpool club favorites to global superstars happened with a speed that no one had ever witnessed before, and with it came pressures that tested every relationship within the group. By the mid-1960s, Paul had taken on a dominant creative role. His vision shaped their sound, his perfectionism drove their recordings, and his relentless work ethic set the pace for everyone around him. The effect on George was significant and increasingly painful. As Paul's influence grew, George found himself marginalized. His songs restricted to 1 or 2 tracks per album, while Lennon-McCartney compositions dominated every release. George was no longer simply the band's guitarist. He had evolved into a serious songwriter with a perspective shaped by his deepening interest in Indian music and Eastern philosophy. Yet the band's internal structure offered him limited space to express that evolution. The Sgt. Pepper sessions of 1967 made this particularly visible. The album was widely understood as Paul's artistic vision, while George's contribution, Within You Without You, was treated by the others as simply another track on a concept album. To George, it represented something profoundly important, a declaration that his creative vision was real and worthy of respect. The disconnect between how he experienced his own work and how the band received it was both painful and clarifying. The divergence between them deepened during the Beatles' trip to India in early 1968. George approached studying meditation with complete seriousness and commitment. It was a genuine spiritual turning point for him. Paul treated the experience more casually, as an interesting break from routine. When Paul attempted to lighten the mood with a joking reference to Georgia Boy, the contrast in their approaches was thrown into sharp relief. George was not in India to be teased about his spiritual convictions. By January of 1969, the accumulated strain had reached genuine crisis. The recording sessions for the Let It Be album were being filmed as a documentary, and the cameras captured a band in serious trouble. Paul's directorial style in the studio, correcting, demonstrating, occasionally condescending, had become unbearable for George. When George finally snapped, telling Paul that he would play whatever Paul wanted or not play at all, it was not merely a quarrel about a guitar part. It was years of accumulated grievance erupting in a single raw exchange. George had quietly amassed a substantial collection of songs that the Beatles had never recorded, compositions that would later be recognized as masterworks, including All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill. The band's consistent preference for Lennon-McCartney material had left these songs unrecognized and unreleased, and that reservoir of overlooked work was central to what made George's frustration so acute. On January 10, 1969, he walked out of the sessions entirely, describing the environment as genuinely unhealthy and unbearable. He stayed away for 12 days before returning, but the deep fractures remained unhealed. The song he wrote on the day he left, Whoa Whoa, was a direct emotional response to the atmosphere Paul's dominance had created. That same year, a private conversation between Paul and John Lennon revealed an attitude toward George that added another layer of pain to their dynamic. Paul suggested to John that George's songs had only recently risen to the level their own compositions had long maintained. George's response was sharp. He had been writing those songs for years. The fundamental disconnect. Paul seeing George as a late bloomer, George seeing Paul as unwilling to share creative space, was not a minor misunderstanding. It was a wound that would shadow both men for a very long time. Despite all the turmoil, 1969 also delivered one of the most significant creative vindications of George Harrison's career. The Abbey Road sessions gave him the opportunity to present Here Comes the Sun and Something, two songs that became among the most beloved in the entire Beatles catalog. Frank Sinatra later called Something the greatest love song ever written. John Lennon declared it the finest track on the album. For a man who had spent years having his compositions treated as secondary material, this reception was nothing short of complete vindication. The band officially broke up in 1970, and George moved without delay. His triple album All Things Must Pass announced to the world just how much creativity had been suppressed during the Beatles' years. The record was a massive success, and it contained within it songs that seemed to speak directly to Paul. Run of the Mill in particular, with its plaintive questioning of how a friendship had been lost. Music remained George's primary language for emotional truth. Throughout the 1970s, their personal relationship was characterized by cautious distance. George gave interviews in which he acknowledged he could imagine playing music again with John Lennon, but not with Paul. These were not throwaway comments, they were genuine expressions of feeling, and Paul found them deeply painful despite presenting a composed exterior whenever they were raised. George's invitation to Paul to join the concert for Bangladesh in 1971 represented one of the few opportunities during this period for some kind of public reconciliation. Paul declined, citing logistical concerns, and another chance for healing slipped away. By the early 1990s, time had softened some of the raw animosity between them. On February 11, 1994, Paul, George, and Ringo Starr gathered at Paul's studio to work on unfinished John Lennon demos. The sessions produced Free as a Bird and Real Love, but old tensions surfaced quickly. George arrived with firm opinions, insisting on bringing in his friend Jeff Lynne to produce the tracks. He warned Paul that without an outside hand managing the dynamic, things could spiral into chaos, acknowledging openly what both men had long avoided saying, that their creative partnership had always been troubled by questions of control and ego. They disagreed about musical choices throughout the sessions, their artistic differences as pronounced as ever after 3 decades. But the work got done, and something in the act of making music together again quietly mattered to both of them. Then came George's illnesses. A throat cancer diagnosis in 1997 was followed by lung cancer and a brain tumor. He survived a brutal knife attack at his home in 1999, an experience that, paradoxically, deepened rather than diminished his spiritual composure. Paul visited George during this period, and something shifted between them in those visits. The decades of distance and unresolved grievance seemed to recede in the face of George's illness, and the shared recognition of how much they had genuinely meant to each other over the course of their lives. Paul sat beside George in a hospital room in New York, and they talked and laughed like the boys they had once been on a Liverpool bus, telling jokes, sharing memories, letting the warmth of their earliest friendship carry them back to something simpler and truer than all the complications in between. At one point, they held hands. It was a gesture that neither man would have been remotely capable of in their youth, not for lack of affection, but because their relationship had always been mediated through the guarded, competitive language of musicians and bandmates. To hold hands was to set down every defense and simply acknowledge what had always been true beneath all the noise. They loved each other, and that love had outlasted everything. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58. His ashes were scattered in the sacred waters of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India, honoring the spiritual convictions that had guided so much of his life and music. His passing left a wound in Paul McCartney that has never entirely closed. In the years since, Paul has honored George's memory in both public and private ways, speaking about him with tenderness, tending to a tree George planted near his home, nurturing the friendship between their children. Their story is ultimately not about conflict or rivalry. It is about the extraordinary resilience of a friendship formed in boyhood, tested by unimaginable success, strained almost to the point of breaking, and redeemed in the quiet grace of two old friends finding their way back to each other before it was too late. Beneath the legendary music, beneath the decades of tension and silence, there were simply two boys from Liverpool who loved music more than anything, and in the end, that was enough to hold them together.